December 16, 1944. The snow fell thick and silent across the Ardennes forest, each flake adding to the white blanket that muffled sound and transformed the Belgian landscape into a monochrome dream. In a foxhole near the village of Lanzerath, Private First Class James Larkin pressed his back against frozen earth, his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. His fingers too numb to feel the trigger of his M1 Garand. Around him, the 99th Infantry Division held a thinly stretched defensive line, Green troops who had arrived in Europe only weeks earlier. Positioned in what Allied command considered a quiet sector where new units could gain experience without significant risk. The forest was so still that Larkin could hear snow falling on pine branches, could distinguish the creak of trees bending under accumulated weight. Could almost convince himself that the war had paused for the winter, that the Germans beyond the tree line were as cold and miserable and uninterested in fighting as he was. Then at 5:30 a.m. precisely the silence shattered. German artillery, hundreds of guns firing in coordinated barrage turned the forest into hell. Shells screamed overhead, trees exploded into splinters, the ground heaved and buckled. Through the smoke and snow emerged something American intelligence had declared impossible. A massive German offensive, 3 armies totaling 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks. Crashing through the weakest point of Allied lines in a desperate gamble to split the Anglo-American forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. But what made this offensive particularly dangerous was not merely its size or surprise, but its nature. The Wehrmacht forces advancing through the Ardennes were no longer the mechanized juggernaut that had conquered Europe in 1940. They were something more desperate and more dangerous, a guerrilla army in conventional clothing, employing irregular tactics, commando raids, false flag operations, and fanatical determination born of fighting for survival rather than conquest. America was about to face a kind of warfare it had not encountered before, an enemy that blended irregular tactics with conventional force, that refused to accept defeat even as their nation crumbled. That would fight not for victory, but simply to make victory so costly that their opponents would give up. And America, in the frozen forests of Belgium, would have to prove that democracy could face such determination and refuse to break. The historical context that made the Battle of the Bulge both possible and critical stretched back to June 1944, when Allied forces had landed in Normandy and begun the liberation of Western Europe. By December, American, British, and Canadian forces had driven German armies back to their own borders, had liberated France and most of Belgium, had crossed the German frontier in several places. Victory seemed inevitable, a matter of months at most. Allied intelligence analyzing Germany's deteriorating strategic position, fuel shortages, collapsed infrastructure. Soviet armies advancing from the east concluded that the Wehrmacht lacked resources for major offensive operations. This assessment was correct in conventional terms. Germany could not sustain prolonged mobile warfare, could not replace losses in men and equipment at rates the Allies could not compete in the industrial warfare that had characterized the conflict since 1943. But what Allied planners failed to anticipate was that desperation would transform German tactical doctrine, that as Germany's conventional military capability declined, its forces would adopt increasingly irregular methods, that the Wehrmacht's final offensive would combine traditional military structure with guerrilla tactics, commando operations, and asymmetric strategies designed not to win decisively, but to inflict such casualties that Allied resolve would waver. The offensive was not conceived as a path to victory, but as a last desperate throw of the dice. An attempt to buy time by making the Allies pay such blood price for every mile that negotiations might seem preferable to continued advance. It was warfare not of conquest but of denial, not of breakthrough but of exhaustion, not of defeating the enemy but of making the cost of victory unbearable. American forces in the Ardennes expected a quiet winter, a period of consolidation before spring offensives, comfortable positions where the greatest danger was frostbite rather than combat. What they experienced instead was a nightmare of asymmetric warfare wrapped in conventional offensive. The German attack began not just with artillery, but with commando operations that would define irregular warfare for decades to come. English-speaking German soldiers, wearing captured American uniforms and driving captured American vehicles, infiltrated behind Allied lines to cut communications, change road signs, and spread chaos. Operation Greif, led by SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, deployed teams specifically trained to impersonate American MPs, redirecting traffic, cutting phone lines, and creating panic about enemy infiltrators that paralyzed American rear areas more effectively than military action could have. American soldiers began demanding passwords and baseball trivia from each other, unable to trust that anyone in American uniform was actually American. The psychological impact was devastating. The understanding that the enemy was not just in front but potentially anywhere, that the conventional rules of warfare no longer applied, that the clear distinctions between front and rear, combatant and non-combatant, had dissolved into fog of unconventional operations. This was guerrilla warfare conducted by conventional army, asymmetric tactics deployed by mechanized divisions. And it caught American forces psychologically unprepared in ways that mere military surprise could not. The symbolic object that came to represent America's determination not to lose against this hybrid threat was neither a weapon nor equipment but something more fundamental: the Jeep. The Willys MB, mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands, had become synonymous with American military logistics. But during the Battle of the Bulge, the Jeep transcended its utilitarian role to become symbol of American adaptability, resilience, and refusal to accept defeat regardless of circumstances. As German forces pushed forward, creating the bulge in Allied lines that gave the battle its name, as American units were surrounded, cut off, and forced to fight in every direction simultaneously, Jeeps became lifelines. They evacuated wounded under fire, delivered ammunition to surrounded positions, maintained communications when phone lines were cut, carried officers between desperate defensive positions, and performed 1,000 improvised roles that doctrine had never anticipated. When the 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, holding a critical road junction against overwhelming German forces, Jeeps were the only reliable connection to the outside world. Racing through German-controlled territory on back roads and forest tracks, carrying the wounded out and ammunition in. The Jeep represented something essential about American military culture that guerrilla tactics could not overcome: flexibility, improvisation, and the ability to continue functioning even when conventional logistics broke down. While German forces, despite their tactical adaptability, remained constrained by fuel shortages and rigid command structures, American soldiers used Jeeps to create ad hoc supply networks, mobile command posts, and rapid reaction forces that operated independently when cut off from higher command. The Jeep's four-wheel drive allowed it to navigate terrain that would have stopped German vehicles. Its simplicity meant field repairs with improvised parts, and its mass production meant that losses could be replaced. In the chaos of unconventional warfare, when German commandos created confusion and German panzers created emergencies, the Jeep became the vehicle that kept American resistance functioning. The symbol that no matter how chaotic the situation became, American forces would adapt, improvise, and continue fighting. The transformation in American military culture during the Battle of the Bulge was profound and lasting. The U.S. Army entered the battle as a largely conventional force, trained for set-piece operations with clear front lines and defined objectives, comfortable with overwhelming firepower applied systematically. The German offensive shattered these comfortable assumptions. American units found themselves surrounded, attacked from multiple directions, facing enemies in American uniforms, operating without clear intelligence about enemy positions or friendly locations, forced to make independent decisions without guidance from higher command. The expectation had been that superior numbers, better logistics, and air superiority would ensure steady advance toward victory. The reality was desperate small-unit actions in frozen forests, towns changing hands multiple times, friendly fire incidents as units fired at anything that moved, and the constant psychological pressure of not knowing whether the soldier in American uniform approaching your position was actually American or a German commando. Yet in this chaos, American forces displayed capabilities that no doctrine had specifically trained them for. They improvised defensive positions from whatever materials were available. They organized ammunition sharing between units that had never worked together before. They established ad hoc communication networks using runners and jeeps when radios failed. They held critical positions not because orders demanded it, but because they understood that their stand mattered to soldiers they would never meet. The transformation was from military machine executing orders to military organism adapting to survive, a shift that irregular warfare had forced and that American military culture could accommodate, ways that rigid command structures could not. The historical evidence of this adaptation appears in countless small actions that collectively prevented German breakthrough despite initial chaos. At the Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, the latter composed largely of untested troops who had expected quiet sector experience, held defensive positions against repeated German attacks. Absorbing casualties but refusing to break, buying time for other units to establish defensive lines. At St. Vith, American forces held a critical road junction for 6 days against overwhelming German forces, delaying the offensive's timetable and allowing Allied reserves to deploy. At Bastogne, the encircled 101st Airborne and attached units, under siege and running short of ammunition and medical supplies, rejected German surrender demands with a reply that entered military legend. Nuts. The response was quintessentially American, informal, dismissive, conveying contempt for the enemy's assumption that American forces would surrender simply because the tactical situation was desperate. These defensive stands were not victories in the conventional sense. American forces suffered heavy casualties, lost ground, and barely avoided complete encirclement, but they prevented German forces from achieving their operational objectives, bought time for reinforcements and supplies to arrive, and demonstrated that American soldiers, when cut off and facing determined enemy, would not collapse or surrender but would fight with determination that matched German desperation. The irregular nature of the German offensive had been intended to shatter American cohesion, to create panic that would turn retreat into rout, to prove that democratic armies lacked the cohesion to function when conventional command structures broke down. Instead, it revealed that American soldiers could function independently, that decentralized command worked when communications failed. That trust in individual initiative was strength rather than weakness. The evidence of American logistical superiority, the foundation that allowed tactical adaptation, appears in the systematic response to crisis that characterized the battle's middle and late stages. When German offensive achieved surprise and created dangerous bulge in Allied lines, when weather grounded aircraft and prevented air resupply, when entire divisions were cut off behind rapidly advancing German forces, the American response was not panic but methodical application of resources. Trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies raced through blizzards to reach surrounded units. Artillery units displaced from threatened positions reestablished themselves and began firing within hours. Tank destroyers and armored units from quiet sectors were rushed to crisis points. Most dramatically, General Patton's Third Army, engaged in offensive operations 100 miles south of the Bulge, disengaged, pivoted 90 degrees, and attacked northward into the German flank within 48 hours, a movement of over 100,000 men that military professionals had considered impossible, but that American logistics made routine. The ability to shift massive forces rapidly, to maintain supply even through chaos, to replace losses in men and equipment faster than they occurred, represented advantages that irregular tactics could not overcome. German commanders, watching American reinforcements arrive while their own offensive stalled for lack of fuel, recognized that they faced not just tactical problem but systemic superiority, an enemy whose abundance made temporary defeats irrelevant because resources existed to absorb losses and continue. The jeeps racing through snow-covered roads carrying ammunition, the trucks delivering rations to surrounded positions, the tank columns arriving from sectors hundreds of miles away, all testified to capabilities that guerrilla tactics could disrupt but not destroy, could complicate but not overcome. By Christmas Day 1944, the German offensive had stalled. Weather had cleared, allowing Allied air power to attack German columns and resupply American forces. Patton's counterattack had relieved Bastogne. German units, having penetrated deepest into American lines, found themselves overextended, short on fuel, and facing American forces that had recovered from initial shock and were counterattacking systematically. What followed was not German withdrawal but stubborn fighting, as Wehrmacht forces tried to hold gains against mounting American pressure. The irregular tactics that had characterized the offensive's opening days gave way to conventional defensive warfare, but the desperation remained. German soldiers, many teenagers or men who had been previously deemed unfit for combat, fought with determination born of defending homeland rather than conquering territory. They held villages until surrounded, counterattacked American advances, and extracted maximum casualties for every yard surrendered. This was guerrilla warfare spirit applied to conventional defensive positions, fighting not to win, but to make winning so expensive the enemy would give up. What these desperate defenders could not understand, what their command had failed to calculate, was that they faced an opponent that would not give up regardless of cost. That would continue feeding resources into battle until German forces were destroyed. That measured success not in casualties inflicted but in objectives achieved. American forces absorbed losses that would have broken armies of previous eras and continued attacking. Not because American soldiers were indifferent to casualties, but because the system that sustained them could replace losses and because the objective, defeating Nazi Germany, justified the price. The transformation this battle produced in American military thinking extended far beyond the immediate tactical lessons. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that future conflicts would likely involve hybrid warfare combining conventional and irregular tactics. That enemies facing defeat would adopt asymmetric strategies, that clear distinctions between front and rear, combatant and non-combatant. Regular and irregular would blur in ways that challenged traditional military doctrine. American forces had faced this challenge and adapted, but the cost had been high. 19,000 Americans killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing in 6 weeks of fighting. The casualties were comparable to major Pacific Island campaigns, but occurring in European winter, against enemies supposed to be on brink of collapse. In terrain and conditions that made every aspect of warfare more difficult. Yet the battle also demonstrated American military's fundamental strengths, logistical depth that allowed rapid response to crisis, tactical flexibility that enabled small units to function independently, and industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than they occurred. Most importantly, it revealed democratic military culture's ability to function under conditions of chaos and uncertainty without rigid command structure imposing order from above, a capability that would prove essential in future conflicts where conventional wars transitioned into insurgencies and guerrilla campaigns. The evidence of how this battle shaped American military doctrine appears in post-war analysis that fundamentally reconsidered assumptions about modern warfare. Military planners had assumed that World War II's European theater would conclude with conventional operations. That guerrilla warfare was a phenomenon of occupied territories rather than conventional battlefields. That desperate last stands would involve static defense rather than mobile operations combining regular and irregular tactics. The Battle of the Bulge shattered these assumptions. It demonstrated that conventional armies could employ guerrilla tactics, that desperation made opponents more dangerous rather than less. That victory was not assured simply because one side possessed overwhelming advantages in men and materiel. The lessons influenced American counterinsurgency doctrine for decades, shaping approaches to conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The recognition that enemies would blend conventional and unconventional tactics, that cultural will to resist could persist even after military defeat seemed inevitable. That wars might not end cleanly with armistice but blur into irregular resistance, all traced back to those frozen December weeks when American forces confronted German desperation in the Ardennes and learned that winning required not just superior resources, but determination to employ them regardless of cost or duration. The Jeep bouncing along frozen roads carrying supplies to surrounded units symbolized this determination, the commitment to continue functioning to maintain supply lines, to support fighting forces through any conditions, to refuse to accept that logistical difficulties or tactical setbacks could prevent ultimate victory. By late January 1945, American and British forces had pushed German units back to their starting positions, eliminating the Bulge and continuing advance toward Germany. The German offensive had failed in all its objectives. It had not captured Antwerp, had not split Allied armies, had not forced negotiations. But its failure came at significant cost, and the style of warfare it represented, combining conventional military structure with irregular tactics. Fighting to inflict maximum casualties rather than achieve traditional victory. Employing psychological warfare and commando operations alongside armored attacks provided template for conflicts that would follow. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated that conventional armies facing defeat would adopt asymmetric strategies. That guerrilla tactics were not exclusive to partisans and irregulars, but could be integrated into regular military operations. That the line between conventional and unconventional warfare was not fixed but fluid, and that future conflicts would likely exist in the gray zone between them. American forces, in refusing to lose despite facing this hybrid threat, had proven that democratic military culture could adapt to such challenges. That decentralized command structures worked better than rigid hierarchies in chaotic environments. That logistical superiority provided foundation for tactical flexibility. And that determination to achieve objectives could withstand both conventional military pressure and irregular psychological warfare. The battle was neither America's finest tactical performance. Too many units were surprised, too much territory initially lost, too many casualties suffered, nor its most decisive strategic victory. But it was perhaps its most important test of whether democratic military could face desperate enemy, employing every tactic available and refuse to quit until victory was achieved. Private First Class James Larkin survived the Battle of the Bulge, lived through the final months of war, and returned home to Indiana in 1946. In interviews given decades later, he would describe the battle not as series of tactical engagements, but as test of endurance. A question of whether soldiers who had expected relatively straightforward advance to victory could adapt when everything went wrong, when enemy was everywhere and nowhere, when cold was as deadly as combat and confusion reigned. He spoke of the Jeep that evacuated him after he was wounded near Bostonia, bouncing through snow and darkness with German patrols nearby, driver navigating by compass and luck, delivering him to aid station that saved his life. The Jeep, he noted, was nothing special, uncomfortable, cold, mechanically simple, but it kept running, kept functioning, kept doing its job regardless of conditions. This, he concluded, was what had won the battle and the war, not heroism or tactical brilliance, though there was plenty of both, but systematic refusal to quit. Capacity to keep functioning when everything suggested function was impossible. Abundance of resources married to determination to employ them until objectives were achieved. The Germans had fought with desperation born of facing annihilation. The Americans had fought with determination born of commitment to principle, that fascism must be defeated regardless of cost, that free nations could mobilize as effectively as dictatorships, that democracy was not weakness but source of strength that totalitarian systems could not match. The Battle of the Bulge tested these propositions in ways no previous engagement had, an American victory, hard-won, costly. Purchased with thousands of lives, validated them not through quick triumph, but through refusal to accept defeat despite every reason to despair. The epilogue to this story extends beyond World War II's end to conflicts that followed, where American forces repeatedly faced enemies employing guerrilla tactics, where conventional military superiority did not guarantee victory, where determination and adaptability mattered as much as firepower and technology. The lessons learned in the Ardennes, that wars do not end when they should, that desperate enemies are dangerous enemies, that irregular tactics can extend conflicts that conventional analysis declares over, that victory requires not just defeating enemy armies but demonstrating capacity to absorb costs and continue until objectives are achieved, shaped American military culture for generations. The Jeep that symbolized American adaptability in 1944 became the Humvee, then the MRAP, evolving with each conflict but representing the same fundamental principle. That wars are won not just by superior weapons but by logistics that keep forces supplied, by systems that keep functioning when chaos reigns, by determination to continue regardless of setbacks. The Battle of the Bulge was America's first major encounter with hybrid warfare, with an enemy that refused to accept defeat and employed every tactic to make victory unbearably expensive. America's response, to absorb the blow, adapt to new tactics, employ superior resources systematically, and continue fighting until enemy was destroyed, established pattern that would repeat through conflicts across decades and continents. It was not elegant warfare or cheap victory, but it was effective, and it demonstrated that democratic societies, when properly committed, could face any challenge and refuse to lose not because victory came easily, but because the alternative, accepting defeat at the hands of tyranny, was unacceptable regardless of cost. The snow that fell on the Ardennes in December 1944 has long since melted, the foxholes have filled in, the forests have regrown over battlefields. But the lesson remains, that freedom's greatest strength is not that it makes victory easy, but that it provides reasons to continue fighting when victory is hard. That abundance's true power lies not in wealth itself, but in willingness to expend it for principles that matter. And that democracy proves its superiority not through quick triumphs, but through capacity to face the worst that tyranny can inflict and refuse to yield until tyranny is destroyed. This is what the Jeep, bouncing through frozen darkness carrying supplies to surrounded soldiers, represented then and represents still, not invincibility but determination. Not perfection but persistence, not victory without cost but commitment to pay whatever cost victory demands, and that commitment, more than any weapon or tactic, is what ensures that when America faces a guerrilla army, when the enemy employs every irregular technique, when the path to victory wins through blood and snow and chaos, America refuses to lose.